you concerned about your personal security?
I stopped being concerned about my personal security. I no longer know why. I don't care. But what I discovered, first of all, this argument most people have, this idea that somehow by keeping quiet and lying low and saying nothing, you'll be safe. But then look at the people who died in the July bombings, the 76. They were young people watching football. Most, I'm sure, have never voted, just unbothered by politics. It's just weekend, do your corporate work, enjoy yourself over the weekend. But then they happen to be in the wrong time, wrong place, and they're now deceased, and people like me are still alive. So it's like there's just no formula. In fact, the vast majority of people in Africa since the 1960s who have died in all these civil wars, refugee camps, and everything have been ordinary people, villagers who have never voted in their lives, who have never worn a pair of shoes. Those are the main victims. So this assumption that those who are more vocal are necessarily in greater danger, I don't believe. In fact, some of us to some extent almost even get protection by our very visibility. There's a certain point, you get arrested and somehow it becomes a public event, and then the government has started, they get so many phone calls from human rights groups, they must explain that, no, you're being kept safely in a nice place and all that, so they arrest you and then almost become hostages themselves. So I don't necessarily have this belief that if you keep quiet and do nothing, then you're safe.
So what do you say to, it seems to me there's a lot of people that on a grassroots level, they'll kind of say like, yeah, like the elites kind of aren't really that good, they do bad things, but like I'm not really willing to put myself forward. Like there's that atmosphere of fear kind of. Like what do you say to generally people that have that mindset?
Well, it's understandable for how much fear they go through. If you see the prison conditions in which some of us were in, the police cells,
The army deployment.
yes, if you're the average person, you just don't want to go in such places. It is really, you have to think twice. And on that I understand, the idea of people being afraid to expose themselves to the state is perfectly understandable. But of course, if I was to say anything to them, I would say yes, but if you have an incompetent and corrupt system, eventually, like a cancer, it will spread to you. Starts off elsewhere, starts off in your foot, and eventually spreads to the rest of the body. So many of those, yes, granted, they avoid politics, avoid being controversial, don't speak out. But then, of course, as we know every day, it is they who now are struggling, can't send the children to school, have no hospitals in the countryside, have no jobs.
But give 98%.
Yes. No, they say they give 98%. So they're the ones who basically suffer the most. So if they enjoy the fool's paradise, fine, but many of them just suffer. But I understand, I wouldn't be that condemning of them. I know what it feels to be like. Even for people like us, many people have to think all the time when you're summoned by the police, when you're taken to jail, you keep thinking, will I come out this time? Who will bail me out? What if they keep moving me around as they did the ministers from the Uganda government in 2007, I think. And if you're an ordinary person, just the sight of somebody in uniform, even without arms, scares them. That I understand. What I don't understand is those who are just indifferent, who seem to know what's going on but choose to be indifferent. But as we say, slowly by slowly, it's spreading like a cancer and eventually comes to them. And will come to them, or will come to their loved ones or next of kin. And many of these so-called middle-class professionals in Kampala enjoy themselves, so-called, work in these high-profile companies. But the trouble is, because the country is now dysfunctional, what happens now is that for every $500 they earn, let's say every month in their salary, because they must, it is taxed and the money goes like nowhere. And two, they must fend for their parents, their siblings, they must take care of all sorts of things. So in some sense, why is it that Ugandans can't save? Because all of us, for everyone working, you fend for 3 relatives, the same relatives who are in that state of happy indifference. So in other words, you can't get around this. When you have an incompetent, corrupt government, it affects you in some way. It always affects you in some way. Not necessarily that you get arrested, but still it affects you. Now you can see we have no power for most of the day in the Kampala. Exactly, most of the country. Many of these indifferent people are being affected. Yes, potholes. But potholes you can say is a few, but just the lack of electricity, all the saloons, the takeaway restaurants and all that. So what does that help them? On the opposition people began with the walk-to-work protests, many of these traders felt, well, that was just disgruntled politicians. Now the dollar is collapsing, and now they discover it actually, that's what these people meant at the beginning. So like all things, we are usually indifferent for the beginning, and then when it starts coming to us, we start experiencing it up front, and then the indifference goes. So it's just a matter of time before they wake up.
So now that it is getting to that point, what methods would you recommend people embrace? Like as far as maybe civil disobedience or something, like what methods can help achieve like some kind of real liberation?
It's hard to know at this stage because I don't know how long we can sustain demonstrations as they did, for example, in Egypt and Tunisia. And I don't know if we have that heart for that. And two, even if we cause change, I don't know what difference it makes. I think right now we need to use the spirit for soul searching, because it's not the first change of government we had in 1986. And you can see already the Egyptians are back to Tahrir Square complaining just months after removing the government. So we need to begin thinking, a lot of introspection. How did we get to this point? Where are we to blame? What role did our indifference play to the situation we find ourselves in? Why don't we know enough? We welcomed the NRM as liberators in 1986. How come we could not see through them? Were they this way all along but we couldn't see them? Or were they people of noble intentions but somehow power corrupted them? That's the first step now, I think, to do some thorough soul searching. Start becoming alert, start reading in between lines in the news, start going beyond just the surface. Maybe will help us.
Who does the soul searching?
The public itself, individually. Start paying more attention, reading newspapers more, listening to radio a bit more, being more attentive to our history and our country. I think that would be the most important thing. The demonstrations are fine, but as I said, they can take off. And if you look, for example, at the opposition, let's say the FDC, there is the president, Kizza Besigye, then you see the vice president for Western Uganda, Central, Eastern, Northern. Yeah, so that very structure itself is an echo of the NRM. So in other words, you start seeing that there is some of the corruption within the NRM 70 government is beyond just them. Because why would FDC not have one vice president? Because they are also aware of all these sentiments that we express. Yes, and that alone shows you that if FDC took power, they'd also become hostage to some of that problem. So-and-so must always remain vice chairman of the party, irrespective of his competence, because he represents some bloc. So that idea of representation as opposed to merit runs through a lot of society. So it means that change alone isn't sufficient. I think we need to start thinking through our history, informing ourselves on projects like this, trying to understand the basis of who we are and how we came to be this.
So, what's Uganda's problem really? What we've received foreign aid, so many trillions of dollars. This is the last question.
What's the Uganda's problem? I think the problem with Uganda, sometimes, I don't know, I've reached a stage where I just think that I think the West, I think white people still have a low opinion of blacks, even if we're in the politically correct era. Because when you keep saying all this aid money, at the end of the day, a lot of this money that we squander and embezzle really is just Western money. In serious terms, a lot of these projects, the judiciary, police, the army, are just kept going by Western. Apparently the West doesn't seem to be bothered that their citizens have no jobs in Greece, Spain, Ireland, Iceland, America now. They're happy to give us this aid. Maybe it confirms the cynical view that aid is really just some other way of, like some other overseas investment. Because, like we say, do you think, I mean, if you read through the WikiLeaks reports, the comments by the American ambassador, as seen by WikiLeaks, you could see that the American ambassador actually knows what's going on. He has a full understanding of the dynamics, and he just recently been appointed. But within a few months, you can see he was fully briefed. He understood the dynamics, he understood there was corruption, he understood this was like more like one-man rule. Exactly, he understood the opposition's weaknesses and the media. He had a very clear picture of the situation. So it can't be that any of the stories we see in the newspapers surprise him. Every embassy, of course, reads our media. Why they do nothing? Maybe it's just the interest. Maybe it's in the interest to tie us down with debts and obligations we shall struggle with for 25 years. Maybe they gain more from aid than we gain. Last year, when the new British government, the coalition government, announced its budget, they mentioned cuts in everything: 5 BBC language services, public libraries, art galleries and all that. So in the middle of all that, cutting of public expenditure, the Chancellor of the Exchequer announced and said, meanwhile, we're going to, in part of our commitment and this reforming, and financial restructuring, foreign aid increases by 11%. And I said, okay, so Britain is in a crisis. On the domestic front, as part of the crisis, cut off domestic programs, the arts and social services. Then abroad, you give further aid. I said that became the best proof to me that aid is just an investment. Yes.
For it. Okay.
Others, as I say, slim down vital public broadcasting and public libraries, the way Europe likes to read. But as part of it, it's like increased aid.
So what do they get?
I don't know, the Land Rovers, the spare parts, their citizens who get employed here, the contracts, the long-term
the jet contracts,
the whole assurance, the British establishment in the country, just all these things. Imagine the tenders for the British High Commission, the USAID. It does something, they benefit from it in some way. It's leverage with the local governments. It's, as I say, it's suppliers for these projects come from the UK. If you bought in, let's say, 20 Land Rovers for projects in northern Uganda and now like southern Sudan, if you supplied southern Sudan with 100 Land Rovers, in the current inflationary atmosphere in the UK, when were you going to sell 100 Land Rovers and that sort of thing? So in some way it becomes like a beachhead. Early steps, your influence, your leverage, it basically comes and works for you and benefits you. So that's what I see. I see the problem of Uganda, a neo-colonial state. The true owners of Uganda, the British and Americans.
An ignorant population.
No, a population partly ignorant, partly helpless financially, can't mobilize. Then also a West which was manipulated by certain clever radical Africans like the ones in Rwanda and Uganda and Ethiopia, manipulating that 1990s Western guild, post-apartheid, post-communism guild. And they're now stuck with the Museveni's. And the Museveni's were crafty enough to understand, as I said earlier, tying your foreign and military policy with the West. So if you have troops in Somalia, and you're one of only 2 African countries that has volunteered to send troops there. And already the West is, exactly, the West is overstretched on the ground in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Libya, and the way things are going soon, Syria. So you become a subcontractor. So at the end of the day, when they sit in the Pentagon looking at that map of Uganda, Uganda is not viewed in terms of the power cuts and everything. It is viewed in terms of, they are taking there, so we need him.
Okay.
Simple as that. So that's Uganda's problem. The minute you try to become truly independent, like Robert Mugabe of Zimbabwe, you distribute the wealth, then suddenly you become a dictator. Then as soon as and somehow every day they say inflation is now 10,000%, 15,000%. Then as soon as you sign a coalition agreement with the opposition, then within 2 days inflation has come down from 1 million% to back to 6% and whatnot. So the smoke and what the Rastafarians call the Babylon system of deception. Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. Really, it's a pleasure.